My name is Naomi Nautarama. If this is your first time to join us, you're welcome. And if you've been with us before, welcome back. We are so glad to have you here. Within the Trailblazers series, we've been exploring different dimensions of what it means to do conservation work in Africa today. And for this new series, we are turning our attention to something that I think sits at the very foundation of it all: communication. Because here is something I want us to sit with. Conservation has always been understood as a scientific endeavour. And of course it is, but it's also a communicative one. The stories we tell about nature, the way we frame environmental challenges, the language we use, and the voices we choose to amplify, all of these things shape how people understand and relate to the world around them. They shape whether someone feels connected to a forest they've never visited or species they've only seen in a photograph. They shape whether communities trust conservation efforts or whether they feel excluded by them. So to guide us through this conversation, we have an amazing guest, Corny Jefter. Corny Jefter is a content producer and a storyteller who holds a master's in journalism and media studies from Rhodes University. She currently works as a content producer for Deal or No Deal South Africa, and she brings to everything she does a genuine, deep passion for wildlife and conservation, and the belief that media can be a powerful bridge between complex science and communities that needs to hear it. So in her talk tonight, The Power of Communication in Conservation, Corny will take us through how communication shapes perception, behavior, and trust in the conservation space. Corny Jefter, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining tonight. Welcome to the beginning of the Trailblazer series. Over the past few weeks, we'll explore conservation from different perspectives. But today, I want to start with a simple idea, one that underpins everything that will follow. And when we think about conservation, we often think about science, ecosystems, biodiversity, data, and research. And of course, those are essential. But conservation is not only scientific. At its core, conservation is also deeply communicative. Because no matter how strong the science is, it cannot create change unless people understand it, connect with it, and feel compelled to act on it. So, welcome to the power of communication, bridging science, stories, and society. There's a lot to unpack on this topic, so please bear with me, and let's begin with my first point. That conservation is a communicative practice. Now, traditionally, conservation has been led by scientists, ecologists, and practitioners working to protect the natural world. But scientific knowledge on its own is not enough. For conservation to be effective, it has to be communicated in ways that people can relate to, in ways that make sense within their lives, their values, and their realities. Because ultimately, conservation is about people. It's about influencing perception, it's about shaping behaviors, and negotiating values. But most importantly, it's about building trust across communities, institutions, and cultures. So when we talk about conservation, we're not just talking about protecting nature. We're talking about how we communicate its value. So this is where storytelling becomes powerful. The framing of perception. Because the way we communicate and perceive something directly shapes how it is understood. and how it is understood shapes how people respond to it. If something feels distant, dangerous, or irrelevant, we become discouraged, disengaged. But if something feels relatable, emotional, or meaningful, we begin to care. So today, I want to show you how communication, particularly storytelling, can completely shift perception. I'm going to start off with an example. Think for a moment about a Western Lowland gorilla in the Congo Basin. What if I described the Western Lowland gorilla as a massive, intimidating animal that is violent, unpredictable, and fiercely territorial? Its sheer strength and imposing presence is perceived as a threat to humans and nearby villages. They are neutralized through illegal trade and used as bushmeat. Now take a moment and think about what that perception feels like. Often we use language that describe and evoke fear, words like aggressive, powerful, and unpredictable, and pair that with certain imagery like the one before you. It creates a very specific perception, a negative one. And when we repeatedly expose the negative portrayals of a species, our instinct is not to protect. It is to distance ourselves. Fear then replaces empathy. And we then begin to see wildlife as something separate from us, something other. But what happens when we tell a different story? In the Congo Basin, there is a silverback gorilla named Jupiter. He once led a thriving troop until one day, most of his group left him and joined another. And only one remained, his partner, Europa. They are currently situated in Yanga on Site 19, busy rooting mines, and this is their story.
As Europa root mines, Flicks and Tuk Tuk play. DNA analysis confirms that this pair are not related to her or Jupiter. Both have been adopted. Jupiter appears in the clearing. And starts mining a dugout hole. Europa seems worried. Jupiter approaches and displaces Europa from her hole. She submissively moves away. Female gorillas rarely tolerate hostile behavior from their silverback, and they will leave the group if they feel unsafe. Rather than why did the females leave, the question becomes, why did Europa choose to stay? Jupiter and Europa have their hands full caring for these youngsters, but they remain patient parents. Male and female Western Lowland gorillas are known to readily adopt youngsters. Good parenting is vital for every young gorilla. Not just learning how, where, and what to eat, but also the social skills needed to navigate troop politics.
So let's just take a moment to reflect on that video. as that video forms the basis of this entire presentation. Ask yourself, what is your emotional response to this species now? What you've just seen is the power of communication. The same species, but a completely different perspective. Through storytelling, Jupiter is no longer a distant, threatening animal. He is humanized. He becomes a leader, a partner, a social, emotional being. And suddenly, instead of fear, we feel connection. What's important to understand is that Jupiter's story is not fiction. It is built on years of research, tracking, observation, and scientific work. But it is the way that information is communicated that gives it meaning. Because in reality, Western Lowland gorillas aren't inherently violent. They are peaceful, intelligent animals who play a crucial role in maintaining the rainforest ecosystem. They disperse seeds and they support forest regeneration. And they coexist with nearby communities and local people. And yet, depending on how they are represented, they can be seen as either a threat or something worth protecting. That shift from fear to empathy is created through communication. So now we have to look at how meaning is constructed. To understand how communication shapes conservation, we need to look at how meaning itself is created. The idea comes from the culturalist theorist Stuart Hall and his representation theory. Hall argues that meaning does not naturally exist in the world around us. Instead, meaning is produced through the way we communicate, through language, images, and symbols. In other words, nature does not simply speak for itself. We interpret it based on how it is represented to us. So when we see an animal, we are not just seeing a biological species. We are seeing what we have been taught to see. For example, a gorilla, like many other species, can be represented as follows. They can be represented as dangerous and aggressive, or gentle and intelligent, or endangered and vulnerable. Each of these representations creates a different emotional response. And those emotional responses influence how we behave. So representation is not just about perception. It actively shapes action. If representation theory explains how meaning is created, the next question is, how do certain meanings become more powerful than others? And this is where framing theory, developed by Robert Edman, becomes important. Framing refers to the way information is presented, specifically how certain aspects of a story are emphasized while others are left out. For example, when we talk about a species, we might focus on the danger they pose or the role they play in the ecosystem. Both are true, but each perspective creates a very different understanding. So, framing shapes how people interpret an issue and what they believe should be done. Now, building on this, we move to agenda setting theory, developed by Maxwell McCombs and Donald Shaw. This theory takes things one step further. It argues that media doesn't just influence how we think about issues. It influences which issues we think about in the first place. In other words, if something is not visible, it is often seen as unimportant. So, in conservation, if certain species or environmental issues are not covered in the media, they can be overlooked, even if they are critically endangered. Together, these theories show us that communication works on 3 different levels. It creates meaning through representation theory. It shapes how that meaning is understood through framing theory. And it determines what we pay attention to, which can be argued in the agenda setting theory. So communication doesn't just inform people. It shapes perception, prioritizes issues, and ultimately influences action. Now let's look at some of the challenges in conservation communication. Despite its importance, conservation communication is not always effective. One challenge is language. Scientific information is often complex, and when it isn't translated clearly, it can exclude the very people it needs to reach. And another challenge is the way communication is delivered. When it is delivered in a top-down approach, where decisions are made without community involvement, it can create resistance and distrust. And finally, there is an issue of compassion fatigue. When people are constantly exposed to crisis-driven messaging, they can feel overwhelmed and eventually disengage. So the challenge is not to inform, but to connect, include, and inspire. To address the gap between scientific knowledge and public understanding, we need to look at how people naturally make sense of information. This is where Walter Fisher's narrative paradigm theory becomes important. Fisher challenges the idea. He challenges the idea that humans are purely logical thinkers who are persuaded only by fact and data. So instead, he argues that human beings are at their core storytellers. We understand the world not just through information, but through stories. And according to Fisher, we evaluate stories based on 2 key principles. The first is coherence. Does the story make sense? Do the events flow logically? And do the characters behave in believable ways? The second is fidelity. Does the story feel true? Does it resonate with our own experiences, values, and beliefs? Because when a story has both coherence and fidelity, we are more likely to trust it, remember it, and be influenced by it. And this is critical for conservation. Because scientific data, while accurate, doesn't always meet these criteria for general audiences, because data can feel abstract, distant, and difficult to relate to. But stories organize information in a way that feels human. They give us character, emotion, conflict, and resolution. For example, Jupiter's story. It's not just information about gorilla behavior. It's a narrative. It's a narrative that has loss, loyalty, and connection. And because of that, it becomes something we understand, and more importantly, something we feel. So storytelling does not replace science. It translates it. It takes complex technical knowledge and reshapes it into something that is meaningful, memorable, and emotionally engaging. And that is what makes communication and conservation so powerful. So if storytelling helps us to understand information, the next question is, what does it actually do to us? And What does it affect us, and why does it affect us more than facts alone? One explanation comes from a concept in psychology known as identifiable victim effect that was argued by Paul Slovic. This idea suggests that people are more likely to feel empathy and take action when they are presented with a single identifiable individual rather than a large group or statistics. In other words, we connect more easily with one story than with many numbers. For example, hearing that thousands of animals are at risk can feel overwhelming and distant. But hearing the story of one gorilla, like Jupiter, creates something very different. It gives us something to focus on, something to care about. And that emotional connection makes the issue feel real. Another important note is that stories also improve memory. We as humans are far more likely to remember a narrative with characters and emotion than we are to remember isolated facts or statistics. So storytelling does two things at once. It makes information easier to understand, as we saw with Walter Fisher's narrative paradigm, and it makes that information more emotionally impactful and memorable. And it is that combination, understanding and emotion, that often drive people to care and ultimately to act. One way emotional connection is created is through anthropomorphism, which is essentially giving animals human-like qualities. When we see animals as social, caring, or emotional, it becomes easier to relate to them. But this approach must be used carefully, because while it can build empathy, it can also be stereotypical, biased, and oversimplify complex behaviors of species. So the goal is to have a balance, to create connection or a story without losing scientific integrity. In today's digital world, communication has become more participatory. People are no longer just audiences. They are creators. They are producers. Memes, for example, have become a powerful way of sharing ideas. They are informative, they are simple, they are relatable, and highly shareable. And they allow conservation messages to reach wider and younger audiences. So memes reflects a shift from top-down communication to participatory, something more collaborative and inclusive. So let's look at the future of conservation and communication. Looking ahead, both conservation and communication are being transformed by rapid technological change. We now have access to tools that not only help us protect wildlife, but also change how we communicate about it. So, for example, researchers can use artificial intelligence that is being used to analyze large amounts of ecological data, identify patterns, and even detect illegal activities such as poaching in real time. Satellite tracking allows conservationists to monitor animal movements across vast landscape, helping to protect migratory species and prevent human-wildlife conflict. Camera traps and remote sensors capture footage of wildlife in their natural habitats, giving us insight that were previously impossible and allows us to share those moments with the global audiences. Drones are also increasingly being used to monitor ecosystems, track deforestation, and survey wildlife populations in hard-to-reach areas. At the same time, digital media has transformed storytelling. Interactive maps, virtual reality experiences, and documentary filmmaking allows audiences to engage with environmental issues in immersive and meaningful ways. Social media platforms also enable conservation organizations, journalists, and even individuals to share stories instantly, reaching global audiences and create real-time engagement. Journalism continues to play a critical role by translating scientific research into stories that are accessible, relevant, and impactful, while also holding institutions accountable for environmental decisions. But with all of these tools, the challenge is not just innovation. It is responsibility, it is ethics, and it is respect. Because effective conservation communication requires more than technology. It requires understanding people. Different audiences respond to different types of communication. For instance, policymakers may respond to evidence and data. Local communities may prioritize lived experiences and practical impact. And public audiences often connect through emotion and storytelling. So the future of conservation communication lies in combining technology, storytelling, and audience awareness to create communication that is not only informative, but meaningful, inclusive, and capable of driving real change. So, what does this all mean? It means that conservation is not just about protecting ecosystems. It is about shaping how we see them. Because the way we communicate nature determines how we value it. And how we value it determines whether we choose to protect it. So the question is no longer just how do we save the environment, but rather, how do we tell its story in a way that makes people care enough to act? Because ultimately, the future of conservation depends not only on science, but on our ability to connect people to the natural world in ways that are meaningful, emotional, and impossible to ignore. Thank you, and that concludes my presentation. I hope that all made sense for you guys.
That was such an amazing and very insightful presentation, and a beautiful PowerPoint, by the way, I have to say. Beautiful pictures. So I want to highlight things. Oh, yes. A lot of love coming to you, Courtney, and a lot of applause. So I want to highlight things that really stood out for me. Stories organize information to make it easy to understand and make emotional impact. And the narrative plus the connection equals to feelings. It brings up the feelings from people. And another thing that I had to learn again that reminded me is that storytelling is not here to replace science. It makes us understand better the science. So thank you again, Courtney. So the first question says, how can we build the capacity of youth members to take advantage of storytelling in the environmental and wildlife conservation space?
Well, that's exactly it. Everyone has their own story, and if you have the access to this presentation, you can have access to social media. So it's never too late just to tell your narrative or your story or whatever you see, just post it out there, you know?
All right. I will give, yeah, I think Claudia also raised virtual hand. Yes, Claudia.
Yes, hello everybody. Hello, Courtney. It's not a question, it's a comment. I said, put it in the chat as well. So a friend of mine's talking about gorillas, they were researchers after Diane Fossey at the Mountain Gorillas. So they do talks and they do that. They take storytelling, telling their own stories with the gorillas, and this is very emotional, but they are science-based. And I think this is absolutely necessary to do it like that. Thank you.
Someone has said storytelling is an extremely good method to link indigenous knowledge and science. Since we don't have any other question, I will take this opportunity to ask a question. So throughout your career as a content producer, personally, as a content creator, digital content creator, sometimes we put content out there on social platforms, but it doesn't get the engagement as much as you thought that it would make. When you're making that content, you think, this is a good educational post or reel that is educating people about this thing, but the audience that doesn't engage with it as you thought. So what formula do you think you use throughout your content production that really moves the people to react on your post? Thank you.
So absolutely. So whenever we post something, we always want it. I mean, that's the purpose of social media, is to, you know, reach an array of people and go viral. But essentially, producing content is not about that. It's not about reach. It's about impact. So even if that post just reached one person, how did that content make that person feel? And that is the most important thing about it all.
Yeah. Thanks, Courtney. I will give a talk to Jabulile. Jabu.
Hi, thank you so much, Courtney, for this presentation. This is actually a topic that's very close to home. Naomi and Sela know that I'm very huge on communicating science. It's one of the things that I am advocating for. We struggle quite a lot, even here at the university. It's quite difficult for someone who's not doing, let's say, maths to sit in a presentation that mathematicians are doing, because then there's this gap, people just cannot communicate science. So I think my question to you then would be, what advice would you actually give to people like, mathematicians, not just like the conservation people only? I do the conservation part of things, but I work a lot with numbers. And I find it quite difficult. Like, it's quite difficult for me to communicate with people, especially when I'm using too much curves, because people are looking at the curves like, what is this? So I think I just want to hear from you. What advice would you give to me as someone who's doing the conservation part of things, but it has a lot of maths, especially if I want to communicate with people?
Exactly. So when we communicate certain things, the last thing we want to do is confuse anyone. So we need to put things in layman's terms. We need to simplify the wording and make it relatable. And we make it relatable through storytelling. So, in any capacity that you can do, if you can tell a story of a certain species, sorry, I don't really know what you do exactly, but just a story of that one species that encapsulates the science behind it. It has, where the story has a beginning, middle, and end, then it would be easier to for that person to absorb that information.
Sela, please, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I really enjoyed listening to your presentation, and I'm a road meme myself because I share those a lot. Yeah, my question is, uh, I grew up in a community where people have negative attitudes towards us, and but because they actually think uh O's are witches. If it comes on top of your house, then the witch is coming to your home. So people mostly they insult them and like stone them. So I'm wondering in those kind of situations, how can we communicate effectively, respecting their culture and their beliefs, but then still bringing that change that would like so that they start respecting the animal as an animal.
No, I really hear you. So this happens a lot, and like that's because when someone believes something, it's very hard to change their minds. But what we can do is absorb it, accept that that is their belief, but then share another perspective of a species and or share another story. Because when people are then familiar with alternative stories or
Mm,
stories with a different perspective, they tend to navigate towards it if it is reiterated to them. But that person then also has to be open into listening to the other perspective of that story. So my encouragement would just be to continue to just try to bridge that fear and that story, and then get people to understand something, because that's essentially why people get scared in the first place, is because they don't understand something, you know.
yeah.
And usually with the use of language and certain imagery, if it has a negative connotation to it, then people understand it as a threat. And that is essentially why people won't be open to um, listening to another perspective, you know. Does that make sense? I hope that answers your question too.
Yes, it makes so much sense. And I have another question. This one is just for you. I'm just curious to know if you could change one thing about how conservation is currently communicated globally, what would that be and why?
Um, Listen, I follow a lot of conservation organizations, and the way they present it, it's engaging. So I would always encourage people to engage and spread content that is informative and that make people feel a certain thing. So when conservations want to share like an endangered species, we don't always want to hear that negative. We want to hear hope. So as much as conservation is, you know, cutthroat in a way, we also want to hear the the stories that have a positive outcome to it. You know, so
Yeah.
that's what I would encourage. So explain the threat, but then, or explain the conflict, but then also have a resolution to that content. So, you know, so that way people stay engaged. It's not just negative, because like I said, if something's negative, people are going to want to distance themselves from it and disengage, you know.
Yeah.
So tell more positive stories, heartwarming
Mm,
stories that communicate effectively to people and make them feel a certain thing. And that's the crux of communication is, yes, we want to understand and stay informed, but it's also
mm,
very psychological. And we need
yeah.
to tap into that psychology through emotion. And that's why the use of language and the use of imagery that we use to get content out there is the most important thing to really bring the audience to you, or the story you want to
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, I really like what the answer that you've given. I've been like before I joined the field of conservation, I've heard part of it, but I heard a lot of negative things that they got me scared, and I didn't even know that the world would continue up to the age that I've reached now. I thought it would end because I was very scared, and I didn't know that there is a part that I needed to play. I thought that we have reached where it's irreversible, but yeah, sharing some like positive stories also makes people have some hope, because if they lose hope, then yeah, there's not they will feel like there's nothing they can do. So yeah, Courtney, thank you so much. I really enjoyed tonight.
That brought me to another question that I received in box, where he says, if someone is not a natural communicator, what's one simple way they can start improving how they share their work?
So if you're not a communicator, um, it's always good to, keep things simple. Um, and that's my only way is or my only advice is to keep it simple, ask questions, and yeah, and get that person to ask you questions or vice versa. Sorry, I don't really know what that person does, so it's difficult to answer in full.
Oh, oh yeah. So there is a question in the chat box from Johan Kruger. It says, Courtney, you are a super engaging storyteller. Is it a craft that you had to work on, or are you simply a natural?
Oh boy, it's something I had to work on. I have never been this person where I can just sit in front of you all and have a conversation. I've had many embarrassing moments where I literally just have anxiety and I just crumble. So it happens to the best of us, but what builds confidence um, is knowledge, is understanding certain things, and just, believing in what you're saying. If you believe what you are saying, then it's easier to persuade the other person to believe what you are saying as well. So it's definitely learned. It's not natural.
Yeah. Um, there's another question in the chat box from Joel that asks, what are the aspects that we need to follow, especially in rural areas, when it comes to storytelling?
So a lot of the times we need indigenous knowledge or people from rural areas to tell their story. So that is it. It's just to tell your story. It doesn't matter regardless of your circumstance. If you have access to the internet, tell your story. Don't be nervous or shy either. And don't worry about reach. Worry about impact. Does that make sense? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think it does. I would like to, I would like you to share one takeaway message that you would like us all to take with us tonight before we
So
conclude.
my my takeaway is everyone is a storyteller. And that is something you have to believe. Everyone has a lived experience. Everyone is knowledgeable in their own way, in their own field. And it starts there. And then you too are storytellers. Everyone is a storyteller and everyone's voice matters. And that is the takeaway. So tell your story and yeah, that is it.
Yes. Let's go tell our stories out there since we are all storytellers. And with that being said, I really want to thank you, Courtney, very much. Please let's applause, give a big round of applause to Courtney, virtual one.